Thanks, Declan. That's right, I saw the light. No, am I the only radiation oncologist here? Is there anyone? Okay, good. I am used to this. But I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour, and Declan is right. And also thank you to Tim and to Bowel for this kind invitation to come back to the UK, where I'd spent a little time earlier in my training. And I did want to go into surgery, and there's something that surgeons and radiation oncologists share, which is really targeted therapy. I mean, it's a simple solution. You have a problem there, you cut it or you zap it. And so what I'm going to give you is a whirlwind tour of the evolution of zapping cancer with external beam radiation. So let's start with the 1930s. This is the precursor to the American Cancer Society that came out with health education posters. It was actually trying to bring people back to work during the Great Depression, and this was one form of employment. And so the only safe weapons against cancer were surgery, X-rays, and radium. And in many ways, these hold true today. And here's just another example. In fact, external beam radiation therapy made the cover of Life magazine in the 1950s as fresh hope on cancer. So where are we today? Well, it's still making the media. The New York Times wrote this op-ed regarding proton beam specifically for prostate cancer, saying it costs more, but is it worth more? And in fact, this may be crazy medicine and unsustainable public policy. So a lot has happened in external beam radiation over the decades. What we know now is that very much advanced treatment technologies, meaning IMRT or robotic-assisted laparoscopic radical prostatectomy, have taken over the way we manage men least likely to benefit from these technologies, while other forms of treatment are less prevalent. So what drives this treatment? This is really just a summary of what has already been mentioned by Dr. Klotz and others. We believe we can save lives. We like to reduce the risk of local distant progression. We'd like to prevent needing androgen deprivation. Lowering PSA is a sort of a very appealing thing when we have a number. And of course, the word cancer, and Dr. Epstein and Dr. Klotz got to that earlier today regarding Gleason 6. So one of the first questions is, if those are our goals, then does radiation indeed work? And the answer is yes, if you treat the right types of patients. So if we look at the intergroup study that compared in high-risk or locally advanced prostate cancer androgen deprivation alone versus androgen deprivation plus external beam radiation, indeed, there were significant benefits in overall survival with numbers needed to treat of 17, and similarly with prostate cancer-specific survival with a number needed to treat of 9. So the answer is a resounding yes. External beam radiation does work if used in the right disease setting, and it did it in a very safe and tolerable fashion without significant long-term toxicity, as these graphs show. So yes, in fact, we can save lives if we treat the right patient. We can reduce progression. But that doesn't explain all of what is driving treatment by any means. And indeed, there is our addiction to technology that has to be addressed. And some have called this a state of gizmo idolatry. The fact that we love, the human love of bells and whistles and gizmos as a proof of competence and also as a source of revenue. So here is our tool as radiation oncologists, the linear accelerator. And this is what treatment looked like about 20 years ago. With conventional, these are orthogonal films, so the era of the 4-field box radiation, and boom, 20 years later, there's an explosion in what's available for us. 3D, conformal, IMRT, proton beam, SBRT, CyberKnife, brachytherapy plus external beam, and any of the above with hormone therapy. So how did it come to this? Well, in fact, there was a local tumor control problem with radiation therapy 20 years ago. We weren't doing that well. If you look at rebiopsy series of patients after external beam radiation, they were shockingly high, positive for persistent cancer. So our solution was rather simple in the field. It was just to increase radiation dose. And indeed, there are five randomized trials proving that dose escalation is better. 4 of the 5, the first 4, are using external beam radiation forms of treatment. Here, a take-home message would be about a 10 to 20% benefit in freedom from biochemical failure for an 8 to 10 gray increase in total dose. Here's the most recent update from my colleague Anthony Zeitman, proving that point that high dose was better than conventional dose in terms of freedom from PSA failure with long-term follow-up. And indeed, we could do this and get away with it. So physician-reported toxicity rates of grade 3 or higher GI or GU toxicity were 2% or less. And if we ask patients in a companion quality of life study, indeed, with long follow-up and excellent response rates, indeed, if we looked at 70 gray versus 79 gray, in the urinary, bowel, and sexual domains, there was no difference. So indeed, we could give higher doses of radiation, get away with it, and improve likely cure rates. None of those studies were powered for overall survival. And so there is not a survival advantage to dose escalation to date. There is one trial that is completed, however, that was powered with 1,500 patients to answer that question. In addition, in the era of dose escalation, do we need hormone therapy along with radiation? As you know, that's rather common in intermediate or higher risk disease, and there is an ongoing randomized trial through the RTOG looking at whether or not you actually have to add 6 months of hormones along with 79 gray of radiation. There are a number of problems with dose escalation, though. One of them is you may not have to treat everybody. In fact, you may only need 0 gray. I won't get into that. It was nicely addressed by Lori in the last talk. There are other problems with dose escalation and conformal radiation. The patient moves and the prostate moves. So you have to account for that. And there have been a number of attempts to ensure accurate delivery, hardware, software advances, immobilization techniques, and daily prostate imaging. So these are a series of serial CT scans of a patient throughout an 8 to 9 week course of external beam radiation. And what you see is that there is non-trivial motion of the target, the prostate, dependent on rectal, bladder filling, etc. So we've come up with image-guided radiation therapy, a variety of ways to skin this cat. A variety of techniques are used. For example, at our institution, we use cone beam CT, built-in CT imaging on the linear accelerator machine. There are also electromagnetic emitting responders, the Calypso or the GPS for your body. Type devices. We also use rectal balloons. I use this in my practice, which cups behind the prostate, water-filled balloon, and immobilizes the prostate during treatment. Doing all of these things, we are accurate within a millimeter on a daily basis. There are ways that are being introduced to actually decrease anterior rectal exposure with rectal spacers, injecting hydrogel in between the prostate and the anterior rectum, such that the high dose region is as further away from the rectum. There have also been other hardware and software advances. So again, this is from the 70s through the 90s how prostate was treated with what we call 4-field box. An anterior, posterior, and 2 lateral beams treating the prostate in the middle. By the 1990s, 3D conformal radiation started to evolve with angled beams, avoiding more of the critical structure, the rectum. And by early 2000s, IMRT was really introduced using inhomogeneous beamlets that would sort of sculpt more to the target and avoid the critical structure, in this case, the rectum. So this has been the evolution, and with that evolution have come clear dosimetric advantages, meaning how much of the rectum receives high doses of radiation, in this case 70 gray of radiation or higher. And you can see from 2D to 3D to IMRT era, there is much more sparing of the rectum from these higher doses of radiation. Retrospective series suggest that if the sparing leads to significant benefits as far as rectal toxicity rates go as well. But indeed, there's only been one randomized trial in prostate cancer of technology and radiation. It was run here in the UK. David Durnley ran this trial of 2D versus 3D, and he proved the point in this study that indeed there was a benefit to the more advanced technology in lowering rates of proctitis. And yet, with only one randomized trial to date, we've gone from 2D to 3D and have adopted IMRT, proton beam, and other forms of advanced technologies without necessarily having developed level 1 evidence to support their adoption. Single institutional series such as Sloan Kettering here do suggest that treating to 81 gray, very high dose radiation, 81 gray, either with IMRT or 3D conformal, that the rates of grade 2 or higher rectal toxicity were probably about a third with the use of IMRT compared to 3D. SEER-Medicare analyses also have suggested very significant p-value benefits of IMRT 3D conformal radiation as far as potential bowel complications. But as you can see by these curves, they're significant because of the high numbers of patients in these large database analyses, not because there was a whopping benefit in the difference. But we do believe that IMRT is better than 3D. In my heart of hearts, I do believe it. There isn't a randomized trial proving that point, but I do believe it for my patients. But it's also a windfall for physicians and their hospitals adopting these advanced technologies. And so I bring you back to the 1930s and the American Cancer Society, which came up with this: beware of the cancer quack. A reputable physician does not promise a cure, demand advance payment, or advertise. Well, here's an advertisement. So this comes from the US. There's a practice called UroRads. These are urology-owned IMRT units. And they said, forget, as the reimbursement for Lupron went down, they said, forget LHRH agonists. Double your practice revenue with a UroRad prostate IMRT center of excellence. And yes, indeed, read the fine print, and it will let you know that IMRT has the sharpness of a surgeon's knife, but the softness of an artist's brush. And Declan, that's why I went into radiation oncology. So just in the New England Journal about 2 weeks ago, this was published. In fact, I'll tell you this, that the New England Journal lawyers withheld this publication for a while as they line-word edited this paper because they were worried of the consequences. That was the lawyers, not the editors. And so indeed, self-referring urologists in private practice settings, or even in those employed by a National Comprehensive Cancer Network Center, once there was ownership of an IMRT machine, the rates went from 13% usage to 32% usage, or from 9% to 42%. Massive lowering rates of the use of radical prostatectomy, massive increase in the usage of IMRT if there was ownership in that unit. So, indeed, IMRT is the national standard for external beam in the US now. Over 95% of external beam is delivered with IMRT, despite there having been a randomized trial between the two. And of course, now we have proton beam. And I'll go through this for interest in time rather quickly. But proton beam is an interesting story. It promises better tumor eradication, perhaps reduced morbidity. So I'll quickly show you the physics. The physics is the beam comes in, goes to a certain depth in the body, and stops. There's less dose at entrance, and no dose at exit compared to photons. It is superior radiation based on this, physically superior radiation. So it's kind of like a searchlight without a tail. So what's the clinical potential? Well, if you're treating a 5-year-old with medulloblastoma, and you have a beam that has to treat the whole craniospinal axis, you can indeed treat that spinal axis without exposing all anterior organs, heart, lung, bowel, everything else, to radiation. Here's an axial slice through the heart. You can see with proton beam sparing that heart. This is massive benefits to that young child, massive benefits. And here's the difference in prostate cancer, proton versus IMRT. More beams are used with IMRT to get the conformality, so there's more of a low dose over larger regions. So if you minus one out from the other, this is what you get. The prostate is treated to the same dose, but there's this low dose bath with IMRT compared to proton beam. The question is, does that have any clinical significance? So you're decreasing the volume in liters of tissue with radiation by using proton versus IMRT, meaning far less liters of volume in the body are getting exposed to radiation. But and here's my shout out to brachytherapy. If you really want to reduce exposure to radiation, brachytherapy does the job the best. There's less scatter dose with radiation. This leads potentially in modeling studies to lower second cancer risk with proton beam. And proton beam is evolving. There's something called scanning technology, intensity modulated proton therapy, which is leading to even more conformal therapy. So these things continue to evolve. So can proton beam indeed deliver higher doses to boost doses to part of the prostate? Can we do focal boosting with things like proton therapy and deliver a sterilizing dose to the whole prostate and then really boosting the area of tumor that's been defined on MRI or other techniques to even higher doses. Planning studies suggest we could do this with this type of technology, though this is not in clinical practice yet. There's uncertainty with proton beam. We're not so sure the deeper it goes into the body, we're not so sure of its end of range, where it actually stops. So when you're treating a young child, craniospinal axis, which is rather superficial, we know that a lot better. So there are these issues of uncertainty, because otherwise we would treat them like this, come in with one anterior beam. The problem is if you're uncertain as to where this stops, you run the risk of running through the rectum. Daily variations, minor variations in hip angle on the treatment machine can lead to distortions in the delivery of proton therapy. I'm just highlighting a couple of examples of uncertainty to this. And so is it indeed an improved means to an unimproved end? Is proton beam superior to other treatments in terms of prostate cancer control? We've done a case-matched analysis of our proton therapy versus brachytherapy series, suggesting that they're equally good. 3 minutes, okay. And can we go to even higher doses with proton beam? We've gone up to 82 gray with proton beam, and our grade 3 toxicity rates, we feel like we're hitting a ceiling, so we've probably hit that ceiling. And is there indeed less morbidity in the treatment of prostate cancer, which is the real question of proton therapy? And despite theoretical physical advantages that I showed you earlier, no studies have suggested a clear benefit. And it might very well be because there is no clinically significant advantage. And that brings us to the business model. This is the map of the US. These are 11 operational proton centers today. These are a number of proton centers under construction, and these are a number of other proton centers in development. And here's a picture of our proton center. It's a complicated, expensive place. In fact, if you look closely at the plans, you'll notice that you mix a little holy water, you have an electric eel, some hot glue, and then the tear collector, and poof, magic smoke, and you have protons. It's expensive. So here's our proton therapy center. Current price tag is about $150 to $200 million for one of these centers. And indeed, who would you rather treat if you had just built a proton center and you had to pay off your debt? So you can see what has led some to believe that prostate cancer is indeed the business model. And that cost-effectiveness analysis suggests it may not be cost-effective. And this map just shows you, it's a Medicare study, shows men will travel all over the states, zip-zack around to that proton center in order to get their prostate treated with proton beam. It's made Men's Health magazine. It was called the magic bullet for prostate cancer in 2011. It only took them 1 year to say that the magic bullet falls short. And it was raising the question of a SEER-Medicare analysis suggesting actually higher rates of GI toxicity with protons compared to IMRT. I won't get into this, but these studies are discordant and they are limited in their analyses. We've pooled a variety of cohorts of patients to compare proton beam versus IMRT as far as patient-reported outcomes. And we've published this suggesting there may be a short-term decrement to IMRT as far as bowel function, but in the long term, it seems to be rather similar. And we're currently running this randomized trial of IMRT versus proton beam in low and intermediate risk prostate cancer to get to the bottom of this, really for more socioeconomic impact than clinical, most likely. And this just shows you it was the trial was highlighted in the Boston Globe, and it was discussed right below a $2 billion loss for JP Morgan. So it has that kind of implication. So with 1 minute, I'm just going to tell you, as this has been an evolution in technologies in external beam, which is really what I wanted to give you a flavor of, this is what is coming. We will be treating patients with what's called hypofractionation more and more. You know that well here. This is fewer, larger fractions. Maybe 8 weeks isn't necessary. Patient convenience is much higher, lower treatment costs. There's a number of moderate hypofractionation trials with good over 5-year follow-up now suggesting really that toxicity and efficacy is rather equivalent to conventional fractionation. There's a number of ongoing non-inferiority trials, including the CHIP trial here in the UK, that really will, I think, prove that point that we can get away with 5 weeks instead of 8 to 9 weeks. The question really then becomes how low can you go? Can you get away with 5 treatments as opposed to 5 weeks? And that brings in stereotactic body radiation therapy and things that you may have heard of like CyberKnife. And indeed, there's a number of series, but you'll note that follow-up generally here is more on the 2 to 3 year range. And really, I think that these are a little immature yet and need to mature in data collection to prove that point. There's an ongoing randomized trial at the RTOG looking at 5-fraction radiation, and indeed in intermediate and high-risk disease, there's also a 7-fraction trial that the Swedes are running. So this concludes the talk, and this is perhaps a nice way full circle. That original New York Times op-ed was written by Ezekiel Emanuel, and he has this quote as well. Novelty cannot be equated with benefit, and intervention's value resides in its ability to reduce mortality, morbidity, or save money, not in its unique mechanism of action. So I think I hopefully have shown you that contemporary external beam therapy is indeed safe, well tolerated, and effective. It improves survival in the right disease setting. Level 1 evidence supports dose escalation. Technology is abundant, and we can use it creatively to spare normal tissue, increase total dose, reduce overall treatment time, account for motion, localize and boost the tumor. But if all forms of high-dose and hypofractionated radiation are comparably efficacious, we need quality of life and economic analyses to determine their true justification. And indeed, we have to continue to support and invest this kind of scientific innovation that has led to the evolution of external beam radiation to harness the potential promise in these advanced technologies when treatment is indicated. And I'll end with this enthusiasm curve. A new technique is introduced, a celebrity is treated, it's then the best thing since sliced bread, then you wouldn't give it to a dog, and eventually you figure out appropriate use. In the evolution of external beam, we need to smooth this adoption curve. Thank you.